Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear comrades, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here among you, and with so many of you having responded to our call to launch an alternative plan for the people of Europe to restore democracy, popular sovereignty, and social justice in Europe. I know that many of you are English speakers. This is why the core of my speech will be in English. On the other hand, being in Paris and being so warmly welcomed and taken care of by our French friends, and particularly by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the Parti de Gauche, Le Front de Gauche, who reconvened our meeting, and after it was annulled by the November murderous attacks, I feel compelled to also briefly address our French-speaking friends in French, and then I will return to English. Mesdames et messieurs,
ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear brothers and sisters, it is a tremendous honor to be here with you and to see how many of you have accepted to join us in launching an alternative plan for Europe in order to restore democracy and justice in the European Union, to guarantee the prosperity of Europe's peoples. We are here today, 2.5 months after the terrorist attacks, to demonstrate our persistence in wanting to meet, to serve the peoples of Europe. 2.5 months after the terrorist attacks against citizenship, against freedom and human life, we are here to express in no uncertain terms our solidarity and our support for all the victims of the terrorist attacks, including the victims of the economic attacks which have been launched on the peoples of Europe, causing despair, poverty, and fear. We are here to dispel the illusions of those who want a Europe that is paralyzed, weighed down by burden of economic debt and the crisis, enthralled to fear, and which doesn't welcome people seeking a refuge, a safe haven from war, from political persecution, from discrimination and famine. We are here to prove that hope can triumph over fear. We're also here to prove that the peoples of Europe can take control of their destiny, and that the only obstacle is the ability to actually make that decision. When I was contacted to sign the appeal for a Plan B for Europe, my country, Greece, democracy was under attack. The creditors of Greece had demanded Mr. Tsipras' signature of a contract which was destined to destroy the hopes of the young generations of Greece, and it imposed a program which was worse than what the Greek people had rejected during the July 5th referendum of last year, referendum where the voters returned a resounding no, a 62% vote against austerity, in spite of the economic and political blackmail, because the referendum was conducted on a day when the banks were closed because the central bank, the European Central Bank, refused to grant the liquidity necessary for the operation of the banks for a week. We resisted that pressure. We resisted that blackmail. We insisted on honoring the popular mandate and came under attack by the very government that we had supported. Early elections, anti-constitutional elections, were called by the government and the lenders to do away with the members of parliament who had said no to the third memorandum and the austerity measures. These were elections that were entirely unprecedented, that were called at very brief notice in order to make it impossible for a new political force to form and to make it impossible for the citizens to understand exactly what had happened. These elections led to an unprecedented level of abstention. Nearly 50% of the voters abstained. Under the circumstances, the governing team carried the day, although 350,000 people, that's 1 out of every 4 voters who had elected Syriza in January 2015, did not vote for them again in September. And, as expected, the attempt to launch a new political party created overnight and organized in less than a week, I'm referring to the Popular Unity Party that I cooperated with as an independent candidate. Well, that attempt was unsuccessful. We were not able to get seats on the parliament. So Tsipras is now governing Greece without any parliamentary opposition and has turned into the party that's going to deal the final blow to the Greek economy, with the most neoliberal measures being passed through, and with the idea that there is no alternative. They were elected in January on the premise that there were alternatives and that hope, not fear, would win the day, which is why the betrayal of the Greek people more upsetting, because it may end up making it impossible to hope for anything better in Europe. Unfortunately, there are not just those who preferred power and were not afraid to betray the people. There are other actors at work prepared to do the opposite of everything that they had said they defended. There are others who feel bound to withstand the forces who seek to impose measures on us which we cannot agree to. There are forces. We are ready to work and fight, struggle to recover our lost freedom, our democracy, our dignity, and human rights. There we are, but there are others alongside, young people who share our conviction that our lives belong to us and that we, the people, will give concrete meaning to our hopes for the future. All of us, and beyond our ranks, others, primarily young people, who are not prepared to bargain away their lives and their future, to trade them away for a song to the IMF, to the European Central Bank, to the European Commission, to the Eurogroup. We're not prepared to sign away our future and pay off debts which are not ours, which were not created to serve the public interest. We will never allow the young generations to be sacrificed in Europe to save the banks. We will never, none of us will ever agree to the death of democracy, to establish an authoritarian, totalitarian regime, the regime of bankocracy and debtocracy. It is our duty to resist. It is our duty to defend ourselves. And that's why I'm here. That's why I was delighted to agree to Jean-Luc's invitation, and that's why I'm convinced that such initiatives as ours are a critical step, an essential step in the struggle that must be waged in the coming months and years in Europe. A struggle which will demonstrate that people are stronger than banks, that the people are stronger than finance, that truth is stronger than propaganda. Thank you very kindly for your attention.
let me now go back to English with our French friends' permission, and let me directly address what I believe we're up against, namely an undemocratic regime, a permanent state of economic emergency, which is conceived to crush the European people, fundamental human rights and freedoms, and democracy as we know it, or as we knew it. This undemocratic permanent state of emergency is being set up in Europe using the economic crisis as a pretext, utilizing austerity, state debt, and the denial of liquidity by the European Central Bank as tools to achieve the annihilation of democratic and parliamentary procedures, the abolition of fundamental human rights and freedoms, the subordination of populations through the obedience of their governments to the dictates of bodies which enjoy no democratic legitimacy whatsoever, no transparency or accountability mechanisms whatsoever, such as the Eurogroup, the European Central Bank, or the Troika. As President of Parliament from February to September 2015, I refused to surrender parliamentary procedure to Greece's creditors. I refused to accept that forces other than the elected representatives of the people can draft and dictate what the Parliament adopts without reading or discussing it. I refused to change my political views, beliefs, commitments, and stance to please the country's creditors. I experienced a literal witch hunt for establishing a Parliament's committee to audit the Greek debt, a committee which found Greece's debt to be illegitimate, illegal, odious, and unsustainable. And I'm here to prove that obedience and subordination is not the only alternative. I'm also here to work together with all of you in order to ensure that what happened in Greece and to Greece will never, ever happen again, and it will never, ever be presented as an acceptable alternative for Europe and in Europe. I consider it my duty to speak out on the ways in which democracy has been violated time and again during the last 5.5 years in Greece, that is, ever since May 2010, under the pretext of the economic crisis and the country's over-indebtedness. I insist in Greece because it is Greece that was picked to serve as a guinea pig in a Europe-wide experiment to move away from democratic and human rights principles and towards a new regime which deifies markets and competitiveness and ignores human lives and human beings. A regime that cares about competitiveness and investment rather than the rule of law. A regime which has already been exported in other European countries, Portugal, Cyprus, Ireland, and is about to be imported into the European treaties and transnational treaties such as the TTIP and TISA. I insist on Greece because crushing democracy in Greece encompasses a perverse ambition to crush democracy in its cradle and to do away with the very principles on which the notion of a European Union of equal sovereign states to guarantee human rights, human dignity, and the prosperity of their people was embedded. I insist in Greece because Greece is also the place where the experiment failed time and again, thanks to the decisiveness, the persistence, the struggle of its people, the Greek people, who time and again proved to be much more courageous than their leadership. I insist in Greece because in reality, Greece is a picture of Europe in the future if we don't plan and act promptly and decisively. It is a picture of France in the future if we don't plan and act promptly and decisively. And in order to plan and act promptly and decisively, we have to share good knowledge of the facts and of the recent and contemporary history. Had the Greek people had real and concrete knowledge of what had happened in Latin American countries during the 80s, they would have been more prepared to defend themselves, and they would have been less vulnerable to the scheme of popular victimization and marginalization. Ever since 2010, democracy in Greece has been slowly but steadily suspended, and what has been installed is this new regime, the memoranda regime, a regime set up ever since May 2010 between Greek governments and a trio of institutions called the Troika, consisting in the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, which became Greece's creditors. A regime in the context of which government undertakes to adopt specific policies set out in the Memoranda of Understanding in exchange for loans to repay the country's supposed sovereign debt. Parliament is coerced to legislate outside and in violation of popular mandate and human rights to implement such policies, and the Troika, through non-elected, appointed employees, is empowered to oversee and survey the country's policies. How did we get here? Back in 2008, when the international economic crisis began, the Greek people were told by their governments, but also by the representatives of the banking system, in the full knowledge of international and European partners, that the crisis would never hit the country because the banking system was stable and immune from toxic bonds. In 2010, the Greek people were suddenly told by their government, the Papandreou government, that the Greek economy was sinking like the Titanic, that the country was over-indebted and in the verge of bankruptcy, and they were then forced to make sacrifices to save an economy which had been destroyed by two governing parties for 36 years. They were depicted in the international media as lazy, corrupt, and living beyond their means. They were threatened each time an election was coming with a clear warning that electing a party other than those which had destroyed the country would mean a disaster. They were told that democratic procedures such as elections and referenda are destabilizing for the economy. In 2011, after massive protests against the memoranda regime and the flourishing of social movements in Greece, including an original social movement to audit the Greek debt, and after the insinuation by the Prime Minister that he would hold a referendum, the people were subjected to a non-elected government led by former Vice President of the European Central Bank, Mr. Papadimos, supposedly to save the country and the economy. A government supported by the two parties which had been alternating in power for 37 years, PASOK and New Democracy, and an extreme right party called Laos. This non-elected government undertook to sign a second memorandum, which, just like the first memorandum, was never ratified by Parliament, but brought as a draft through the extraordinary procedure of extreme emergency in February 2012. In May 2012, elections were held. The people were particularly warned not to elect Syriza, the radical left party which was fighting the memoranda and austerity regime, asking for democratic procedures to be restituted in the country, and campaigning for an audit of the debt, a debt write-off, and a moratorium of repayments until growth was obtained for the country and its people, a solution analogous to what was decided for Germany back in 1953, so for the defeated Germany after the Second World War. After 2 consecutive elections in May and June 2012, the Samaras government was formed as yet another alliance government between the same two parties, New Democracy and PASOK, with the addition of a third party, the Democratic Left. The memoranda regime, instead of being gradually finished as promised by 2 out of 3 governing parties, was rather aggravated. For almost 5 years, from May 2010 to December 2014, when this government was dissolved, it was not the Greek people making sacrifices, but rather it was the government sacrificing the people for the sake of saving themselves under the pretext of saving the economy and the country and diminishing the debt. The memoranda of understanding.
Le mémorandum, le protocole d'accord, on l'appelait aussi des programmes d'ajustement et même des programmes de sauvegarde. Le premier protocole d'accord, le mémorandum, a été signé en mai 2010, de février 2012 ensuite, et aucun protocole d'accord n'a été discuté au Parlement. Malheureusement, il y avait un troisième mémorandum.
That Syriza, the party to which I belonged as well, had promised never to sign, and which its leadership signed and brought to Parliament last August through unprecedented, extraordinary procedures, and which it is now implementing. The country was therefore introduced into a so-called adjustment program, and what they really mean by program is a different political regime under which basic constitutional guarantees and democratic principles are violated, and so are fundamental rights and freedoms of the people. The program consists in austerity measures that, among others, include the demolition of labor law, labor rights and guarantees, deep public spending cuts, public sector job cuts, tax increases and tax creation, privatization of public enterprises, especially the most profitable ones, and so-called structural reforms which equal the shutting down, merger, or destruction of public infrastructures and enterprises such as the national radio television. These measures have pushed the economy into deep recession and have grossly undermined the enjoyment of fundamental human rights, as was pointed out by the United Nations independent experts on the effects of foreign debt on human rights, both in his 2013-2014 report and in his preliminary conclusions of last December after respective visits to the country. Ever since 2012, there have been several decisions, 7 actually, by the European Social Committee, finding that the European Social Charter on Social Rights has been violated in the case of Greece, as well as several decisions by national courts to the same effect. The National Committee of Human Rights, an independent consultative organ of the state, has issued several statements underlining that the austerity measures adopted in Greece violate international, European, and national human rights provisions and state obligations. These measures resulted in monstrous rates of unemployment, homelessness, poverty, inequality, social exclusion, and severely reduced access to public services such as education, healthcare, and justice, contrary to what constitutes Greece's, but also the European Union's and the IMF's human rights obligations. Unemployment, let me give you some numbers to have a real sense of what we're talking about and how this bailout worked. Unemployment rates rose from 9.7% in 2009 to 27% in 2015, with youth unemployment reaching the unprecedented rate of 60% among young men and 72% among young women. In numbers, this means 1.5 million unemployed in an active population of 3.5 million. Hundreds of thousands of youngsters, especially young scientists, were forced to emigrate, being unable to find a job in their country. A suicide epidemic led to a loss of thousands of lives out of despair. Almost 300,000 households were left without electricity for months or even years, and several deaths among the young, the old, the children were reported due to suffocation or fire from self-made heating machines. Half of the children in Greece, that's 500,000 children, are living below the poverty line. Schools have been operating without books, without heating, and lately without teachers, and young pupils are often reported to faint at school out of starvation. Hospitals operate with one nurse for 40 patients, and the last time hospital employees protested, they were on a march, there was a big police force trying to prevent them from passing in front of the parliament. That was when I had to intervene as president of parliament and say this was a fundamental right of these people especially, but of all people, to demonstrate and demand their rights. Time and again, cancer patients, but also HIV patients, were deprived of access to medicine to combat their illness. 1 out of 2, actually 44.8% of pensioners, receive pensions well below the poverty line, and this is a percentage which is about to be multiplied with a new social security law drafted by the Tsipras government, which is about to cut pensions for the 12th time. There's a discussion in Parliament on this initiative next Tuesday. Hundreds of thousands of small and medium enterprises have been shut down, and this is also about to be multiplied as self-employed professionals are being asked to pay unbearable percentages of their income, which can go up to 90% of their income in taxes and social security contributions. The country has lost around 25% of its GDP. And all this has been the outcome of laws pushed in Parliament through extraordinary, unconstitutional, undemocratic procedures, with laws of several hundred pages construed in either 1 or 2 or 3 articles at the most, in order for members of Parliament not to be able to vote yes to certain provisions and no to others. These laws are inserted and voted upon in less than 48 hours in total, under the explicit threat that they will either be approved or the next installment of loans to Greece would not be disbursed and the country would go bankrupt. We have had an 800-page law construed in 1 article in November 2012, a 300-page law construed in 2 articles in April 2013, an 800-page law construed in 3 articles in March 2014. The country was asked to sell out its public property and public enterprises at extremely low prices to repay the debt, a sell-off effectuated without any transparency or parliamentary control. Parliamentarians, including myself, were even denied access to documents concerning these deals. At the same time, last-minute provisions and amendments ensured impunity for those responsible for damaging the economy or the public interests. Because contrary to the media propaganda devices, the memoranda also grossly rely on corrupt officials and preferential relations between those in power and a sui generis oligarchy, which benefits from the dismantling of the public sector, while at the same time it is shielded from analogous taxation. A series of laws were issued not by the Parliament, but by the President of the Republic, acting on governmental proposal, the so-called Presidential Acts of Legislative Content, fraudulently invoking a state of unforeseen and extreme emergency in order to bypass parliamentary debate. And I do believe that this experience can be very useful for France right now, under a different context, but with a lot of analogies in the modus operandi. These policies were also promoted through police brutality, including not only physical violence, but also dangerous chemicals used by police forces against protesters and in general against citizens. Military measures such as the enlistment of those in strike were also used as a tool to obtain obedience. Workers at the public transport, at the naval transportation, at the public energy enterprise, as well as teachers who were on strike to defend their jobs, their rights, or the state ownership of the enterprises they were working in, were enlisted, which means that their services were put at the disposal of the state under the justification that their strike was posing as a threat to public order or public health. During all this time, there was no sign of growth. Rather, the country is going through the longest recession, 7 years now, ever experienced in Europe at a time of peace. The population is subject to a humanitarian crisis directly linked with the so-called bailout measures. As for the debt, it has risen from less than 120% of the GDP before the bailout to more than 180% after 3 memoranda of understanding and rising. Meanwhile, representatives of the Troika who drafted these monstrous agreements have repeatedly made public admissions on being wrong in their calculations. This meant that they publicly admitted being wrong on estimating that the measures dictated and the taxes imposed would address the country's economic and debt crisis. However, those admitting being wrong kept insisting, and still keep insisting, that the same policies continue, which proves that the object of these policies was never to redress the economic and debt crisis, but rather to control a sovereign country and its people and misappropriate its property. On January 25th, it's almost a year now, of 2015, the Greek people, through general elections, gave Syriza a percentage close to an absolute majority in parliament and provided a clear and unequivocal mandate to government and to parliament to do away with the memoranda, to do away with these disastrous, homicidal and anti-democratic policies, and to demand an alleviation of the country's debt. On April 4th, 2015, a special committee of the Parliament was formed called the Truth Committee on Public Debt to conduct an audit and a legal assessment of the debt. It has issued its preliminary report in June 2015, which I brought together, and it is available at the entrance. I think it's already been distributed to you, and I would advise you to keep it and cherish it, because we don't know how many more copies we're going to have. I'm very, very glad that the scientific coordinator of this committee, Eric Toussaint, is here with us and will be intervening in one of the next panels, and also Margot Solomon, Professor Margot Solomon, who is also a prominent member of our committee. Now, this committee issued a preliminary report, the preliminary report of June, which found Greece's sovereign debt to be, as I said before, illegal, illegitimate, odious, and wholly unsustainable. It found that the sovereign debt had been concluded through unconstitutional and illegal procedures, violating parliamentary process, fundamental human rights and freedoms as set out in the international treaties and international law. It further found that Greece's creditors had been acting in bad faith ever since 2010, knowingly burdening the country with unsustainable loans and turning what was a private debt into public debt to save French, German, and, at a later stage, Greek private banks, to the detriment of the Greek people who were attacked by a taxation and austerity tsunami as a means to support the recapitalization of the banking system. The committee, through the disclosure of documents contained in criminal case files, as well as through hearings, revealed that the IMF and its member states, which are all members of the European Union, had known ever since March 2010 that the Greek debt was unsustainable, that measures contained in the very first memorandum, that of May 2010, were bound to provoke deep and lasting recession. This is the formulation of the IMF documents, and the disruption of the social tissue. It revealed that French and German banks profited from their privileged knowledge on the unsustainability of the Greek debt and got rid of the Greek state bonds they were holding between 2010 and 2011, thereby gaining dozens of billions of euros when the 2012 haircut was effectuated. The committee report further revealed that when Greek banks, social security funds, and 15,000 petty bondholders and public sector institutions were destroyed by that same haircut, it was only the Greek private banks which were rescued. The report shows that, contrary to the media propaganda launched ever since 2010 to depict the Greek people as lazy and living beyond their means, public expenses in Greece were kept well below the European average in all fields except for defense, where a series of major corruption cases involving government officials and international firms have been detected. The report also shows that 92% of the loans given to Greece in the context of the memoranda regime are not actually given to Greece, but they are directed back to the creditors to repay the so-called debt. The committee reached these preliminary conclusions also through hearings and evidence collection, and it must be said that the only authority which refused to fully cooperate with the committee was the head of the National Central Bank of Greece, who refused to provide the committee with the transactions concerning the loan agreements and the loans purported to be given to Greece in the context of the memoranda. He invoked bank secrecy. The committee started through a meeting with Eva Joly, who is vice president of the tax committee in the European Parliament, to investigate in the LuxLeaks scandal and the repercussions of tax evasion and tax avoidance of firms active in Greece and profiting from tax havens installed in Luxembourg and in the Netherlands, a situation which has deprived Greece of several billions in tax revenues. Despite these revelations, Greece's creditors insisted that the Greek people continue to pay the price and repay a debt which had reached 325 billion euro. This meant that every baby born in Greece owed, during the first semester of 2015, 32,500 euros. A week after the committee preliminary report was issued and publicized, and in specific in June 25th, a 48-hour ultimatum was addressed to the Greek government by the European institutions, asking it to accept, contrary to the January popular mandate, a series of measures further dismantling labor law, abolishing social security guarantees and legal protection for over-indebted citizens, and demanding the sell-off of the most precious public assets and public enterprises, major ports, airports, and public infrastructure to repay an unsustainable and odious debt which was misleadingly presented as sustainable. On June 27, upon government's proposal, a referendum on the ultimatum was decided by the Parliament to be held on July 5th. This was the first referendum ever held in Greece ever since 1975, when the Greek constitution was adopted, right after the dictatorship. During the referendum week, international and foreign officials, including the European Commission President Juncker, the European Parliament President Schulz, the Eurogroup President Dijsselbloem, made repeated statements concerning the referendum outcome and addressed explicit and implicit threats to the population in case the people rejected the measures. There were government and international officials who went as far as stating that a humanitarian disaster would come if no prevailed, and others explicitly saying that the people would be punished should they reject the measures. The referendum was held with the banks closed and capital controls imposed for more than a week due to the ECB's refusal to provide liquidity after the referendum was decided, as another attempt to influence the people's vote. And this was the second time bank liquidity was used as a tool to change democratic decisions, the first occasion having been an analogous extortion directed against the Cypriot parliament in March 2013. And yet, despite all this propaganda, despite all this terror, economic terror, democracy prevailed. The people, by a clear 62% no vote, rejected the disastrous measures. 3 days before the referendum, an IMF draft report was published, officially admitting for the first time that the Greek debt is unsustainable, meaning it cannot continue to be reimbursed without jeopardizing the respect of the human rights of the people and the social cohesion. The report was dated June 26, 2015, and it had been concealed from the people for more than a week. What followed the referendum outcome and the 62% no was a disgrace. It was a disgrace for the European Union, it was a disgrace for the world, it was a disgrace for democracy. The creditors, including European institutions, refused to consider the referendum outcome. They insisted, under a threat of provoking a bank failure and a humanitarian disaster, that measures harsher than those initially proposed and rejected be adopted. A week after the glorious and unequivocal no issued by the referendum, the government signed on measures worse than those rejected by the people. The people's no was turned into government's yes, under an explicit threat that the ECB liquidity would be permanently shut down and the country would suffocate and be forced to exit the Eurozone, a threat which directly contravenes EU law, as was admitted by ECB Vice President several months later. What the Greek government accepted in the dawn of July 13, 2015, was that Parliament would legislate on pre-formulated texts of hundreds of pages with no deliberation and at pre-fixed dates, with an emergency procedure and with the banks still closed. Further, It accepted that court decisions finding previous memoranda measures containing cuts in pensions unconstitutional, those court decisions would be overturned by new memoranda measures to provide for new cuts in pensions. This extortion was baptized prerequisites for an agreement, and Parliament was called to abolish laws it had only voted during the previous 4 months and to refrain from any legislative initiative without prior approval by the creditors. This is what is explicitly provided for in the July 12th Euro Summit statement. An over 100-page law construed in one single article was passed on July 15 in less than 24 hours pursuant to the Euro Summit statement. A 1,000-page law construed in 3 articles was passed on July 22, 2015 in less than 24 hours. It included in one single article all 1,008 articles of the Greek Code of Civil Procedure, a code which had also been rejected in December 2015 by a 93% no vote at a country-wide referendum of lawyers. This was a law which had been tabled by the previous government, the Samaras government, and withdrawn subject and subsequent to the lawyers' referendum. It was resurrected and brought to Parliament by a Minister of Justice of the Tsipras government who had been one of its opponents. He signed and introduced the law, saying on parliamentary record that he does not agree with its provisions, but sees no alternative to prevent a bank failure. And when asked if amendments could be made, he responded on parliamentary record that regrettably the creditors would not allow amendments to the law by Parliament. After the 3rd memorandum was signed in the middle of August, an almost 400-page law was passed on August 14th in 24 hours, with the Parliament being forced to expeditiously reopen in the heart of summer recess. Right after the referendum proclamation, creditors were repeating that trust between Greece and themselves had been shattered, suggesting that the very decision to hold a referendum and the exercise of the people's vote was a breach of trust. Right after Parliament voted on those so-called prerequisites, contrary to popular mandate, and overturning the referendum outcome, the European Commission representative bluntly announced that trust has been restored, thereby linking trust to the abolition of parliamentary and democratic procedures and the violation of popular mandate. Statements issued by the Eurogroup in July and August explicitly excluded any discussion for a debt write-off. At the same time, more loans of 86 billion euros were undertaken by Greece, and now every baby born in Greece owes 41,000 euros. Parliament repeatedly legislated under duress and coercion, and after this atrocious legislation was passed, attesting that a large part of the deputies of the major governing party, Syriza, including myself as President of Parliament, 2 vice presidents, the president of all 4 competent permanent parliamentary committees, refused to vote the legislation imposed and the undertaking of a 3rd memorandum, the government, in agreement with the President of the Republic and the creditors, bypassing Parliament and the presidency thereof, inadvertently dissolved the Parliament to seek what they qualified as a more stable majority to implement the measures which the people had rejected. Snap elections were proclaimed on August 28th to be held on September 20th, 2015, and Syriza, the party which had asked for the chance to do away with the memoranda was now asking for a second chance to implement them. For the first time in more than 5 years, the creditors were happy that elections were held in Greece, and with good reason, because as I said before, almost 50% of the voters abstained, 45.5% did not even go to vote, and another 2.5% registered a blank or invalid vote, which was an unprecedented abstention record in the last 40 years. Most Syriza members of parliament who had opposed the measures either did not run in those elections or tried to form an electorally viable coalition under the name Popular Unity within less than a week, an effort which fell short by 7,000 votes from achieving the introduction to parliament. During the electoral period, on September 10th, a vote was held in the UN General Assembly to establish principles in order to protect over-indebted states against abusive practices by creditors. Despite the fact that these were principles largely protecting Greece, Greece abstained from the vote, as did most of the EU members, under constant and direct pressure by the European Commission, which was clearly acting in a conflict of interest. Germany and the United Kingdom voted against these principles, which are adopted, however, by a large majority of the United Nations General Assembly. It is interesting to observe how Germany, a country which benefited from a write-off of more than half of its debt back in 1953, a country which has still not repaid reparations to Greece, which are not written off and are due to this ever since the Second World War atrocities, reparations calculated to rise to a sum between 278 and 340 billion euros, with modest estimates, is playing a protagonist role in using state debt against economically weaker countries, weaker states, to promote this new type of economic enslavement. Right after the elections and before the new parliament was convened, the Debt Truth Committee met, as had been scheduled, and issued its second report analyzing the illegitimate, illegal, odious character of the third memorandum and the respective new debt, which is obviously unsustainable as well. Ever since the September elections, the reduction of democratic procedures has been even more acute. Presidential acts of legislative content are issued at an unprecedented frequency. The Parliament almost exclusively legislates under emergency procedure and always to fulfill the creditor's demands. Legislation adopted or tabled during the last 3 months includes the abolition of protection for over-indebted homeowners, a sell-off of the country's banks, a sell-off of what is left of the country's public assets, infrastructure, and enterprises, a new series of pension cuts, the 12th in a row, and new social security contributions which make life unlivable for young professionals, self-employed persons, and agriculturers who are all on different types of struggle right now in Greece. Members of the governing parties who oppose these measures are asked to surrender their parliamentary seats, and if they do not vote on the measures and do not surrender their seats, they're thrown out of their parties. This has been the practice of the previous governments when it came to memoranda measures. This practice was fiercely criticized by Syriza and is now being enforced by Syriza. What was advertised as the government's parallel program to protect the weaker was tabled and then taken off the table by the government under the creditors' pressure. And the Truth Committee on Public Debt is put on the spot. It is being literally persecuted. Its reports were removed from the Parliament website. Its offices were removed. Its works were declared terminated before they were finished through a decree of the new President of Parliament, who is now also trying to confiscate the personal items and archives of the committee members. By the way, on Monday there will be an attempt to confiscate the committee members' archives with the aid of police forces, as a letter of the new President of Parliament informed me. The society, on the other hand, is embracing the committee, and already we found a citizen who offered his offices in order to shelter the committee. But the society is sinking in despair. The people are being asked to deny their dignity and hope, and they're being asked to accept that there is no alternative by the very political party which was elected to prove that hope would prevail over fear and economic extortion. Creditors are more and more satisfied, irrespective of the fact that what is now sinking like the Titanic is the very principles behind the creation of the European Union: democracy, peace, social justice, respect for human rights and human dignity, the prosperity of the people and of the societies within Europe. Recession continues, and the country's debt is estimated to reach 200% of the GDP within the next 2 years, according to IMF reports. The memoranda are no bailout agreements. They represent a death sentence regime for the Greek people and for the European people. They represent, and they put forward, a direct coup against democracy. They promote a totalitarian regime which uses banks and liquidity in an analogous way as tanks and guns were used at previous periods. This is a regime which will either be overthrown by the European people and their elected representatives, or it will reign in Europe and substitute the European acquis of human rights and democracy, which can only be based in the respect of human liberties, human lives, human dignity. No one can pretend not to understand what is now happening in Europe, and elected representatives of the people cannot pretend not to have a choice, not to have an alternative. To surrender democracy, parliamentary sovereignty, the rule of law, and the respect of fundamental human rights can never be a choice. To sacrifice people and whole generations to save banks and bankers can never be a choice. To violate popular mandate to satisfy the creditors can never be a choice. On the contrary, we have a duty and a democratic obligation. We do have a true choice to take decisions, to claim the establishment of a debt auditing procedure, not just as an obligation of governments and states, as set out in European Regulation 472, a regulation never enforced by any European government, but as an independent, democratic, collective, and sovereign right of the people, who are entitled to know how the debt was created and to refuse to pay a debt which is not their own, meaning a debt which has not been created in the knowledge and for the benefit of the people and of the state. To establish a separate sovereign right of states to refrain from any debt repayment before the debt audit is concluded, and an obligation of other states, European and international institutions to respect this right and to refrain from any act of coercion. To set the auditing procedure under the auspices of national parliaments, which should examine the audit outcome in public sessions. To establish standards for the independence, competence, expertise, impartiality, and representativeness of debt audit commissions. The commissions should be international, including experts, but also representatives of the society involved in the auditing and transparency processes, and the structure and experience of the Debt Auditing Committee established in Greece, I believe, can serve as a very good model. To establish the obligatory cooperation of all state, public, European, and international institutions and actors with the auditing committees, and to provide for penalties for non-cooperation. To envisage liability procedures for international and to enact such procedures for international and governmental actors who deliberately or knowingly violate their international obligations and damage states and people in the process of debt repayment. To claim democratic control over the banking system. The way the European and international banking system is evolved, it has become a separate, compelling power operating through opaque methods with no democratic legitimation or public control. This is not an acceptable situation in democracy. Bureaucrats and bankers cannot substitute or control the people's elected representatives. They cannot dictate policies and manipulate policymakers. They cannot deny to respect the people's mandate. Democratic control over the banking system means true transparency in the decision-making processes, the subordination of the banking system to the democratically legitimized representatives of the people and democratic institutions, the public ownership and control over banks and over central, national, and international banks. When it comes to public expenses, there should be a European-wide campaign to limit military expenses. Disarmament should become a priority, and the cutting of armaments expenses should become part of our agenda. And I would offer the example of Greece, which for decades spent a huge percentage of its budget in armaments, only to promote corruption between its government officials and international arms firms, who always provided with defectuous products. We have an obligation to promote and reinforce transparency and anti-corruption legislation, which will only guarantee fiscal equality. To provide for true justice and accountability for those in charge of public spending and governance, because injustice is an intolerable situation and a poisonous sentiment for societies. Accountability mechanisms should be ensured for those who indebt countries to the detriment of their people. To reinforce direct democratic procedures, such as referenda, and to establish obligatory universal respect of their outcome. To establish new forms of participation of citizens, and especially the younger generations, in the decision-making process and the implementation overview. And I would say for our project, for Plan B, it must become part of our agenda to incorporate and use the knowledge, expertise, and ideas of those currently marginalized, of the younger generations, of the young scientists in forging our proposals. To promote a European conference on debt and to constantly broaden our point of view and our agenda. The message to be broadcast by our conference should be: we are not surrendering democracy. We are not surrendering our rights. We're not surrendering our freedoms. We're not surrendering our dignity. We're not surrendering our lives, our countries, or Europe to the Euro bureaucrats and bankers. We are claiming what is our own, and we will prevail. Thank you.